Thank you, Thomas. Now, let's move on the discussion about the section about customs borders of New Zealand and the situation of the Māori people as users and also as managers. Customs is the administration of a state of borders and goods. For New Zealand's borders are not just at airports. They are everywhere people or goods could enter the country. The New Zealand Customs Service protects New Zealand's borders and were established in 1840. The Maori name is the Mana Erai o Aotearoa. It means the authority that screens and protects New Zealand. We know that traditional Maori management relies on the application of Maori customs, values, and beliefs, Maori protocols, and also Maori language. And we also know that Maori management is contextual, based on the respect of Whakapapa, and also on the respect on Aronga Maori. My first question here, Thomas, is this one. What is the role of the Maori in terms of customs borders?
Okay, so the New Zealand custom borders were put in place by the New Zealand government. That's true. Your statement about the New Zealand customs was actually present at the time of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. The first customs officer was present at the time, at the signing. The purpose, I believe, and I'm not sure if it's being researched, it probably needs to be researched more appropriately, but from what I understand, the purpose was in relation to the fourth article of the Treaty of Waitangi, which talks about Māori people and all settlers and traders of New Zealand at the time becoming subjects of the British Crown or subjects of Queen Victoria. Based on that fact, customs managed the border on behalf of all the subjects of the Queen Victoria, which is all New Zealanders. This idea of border protection has existed since then, pretty much through to the legislation development and the laws that were developed around the protection of the borders for all New Zealanders, which include Māori. Māori, I don't think, were put into any different sort of class or any different sort of relationship with the Crown in terms of their relationship with customs. So customs were there to screen and protect all of New Zealand borders on behalf of all New Zealand people. Only in recent times, in the last 20 years, has it been recognised that there are Māori rights or Māori involvement in terms of border protect. We still have a long way to go. In the current environment that we exist in at the moment, we are only just starting to talk and create relationships with iwi around work that customs does. I mean, another point to make here also, the reasoning behind this is that the New Zealand Customs is a revenue gatherer. So we are the second highest revenue gatherer for the country. So you can imagine if our ancestors were still the revenue gatherers of Te Whaitangi and of the rest of the country, you can imagine we'd be having a very different conversation today about resources. So those resources that were gathered at the time off the boats and the ships that were oared, that were anchored in the Bay of Islands, went directly to the government at the time, or directly to the administration that eventually turned into the government, and that still exists today. We only just realising that with post-settlement agreements and with what's been happening in our country in the last 50 years, but more specifically in the last 20 years, we need to ask ourselves what involvement are Māori in particular as a partner, as a treaty tiriti or treaty partner of the Crown, what involvement should Māori have in terms of the border? And that's really a question that's being asked of customs at the moment. How do Māori get involved with New Zealand customs, and how does that impact on our border protect work that New Zealand customs do on behalf of all New Zealanders and Māori? So with the growing trade development happening within Māori business right now, that's becoming a bit more of an important question for New Zealand customs. Or te mana ārai, as you refer to mana ārai o Aotearoa.
Thank you, Thomas. A more general question now. It's a question which relates between the Maori culture and the phenomenon of borders. What is the worldview of Maori people regarding the phenomenon or the institution of borders?
I couldn't answer that. I couldn't answer that with any real opinion, because I don't really have any background information for that. But one thing I can tell you is that, for instance, in the area of tourism, Māori has a huge input into tourism. So because of that, international people that come to New Zealand come seeking an experience of Māori people based on what they sort of see and they hear about us. Mm-hmm. So, lots of tourists come here, and lots of tourists go to places like Rotorua. They go to places up north where the Tiriti o Waitangi was signed, and the northern part of the country is beautiful. They tour around the country seeking experiences, or seeking an experience with Māori people, because they've heard so much about us. It is a phenomenon. I think that it is recognised by our New Zealand government that our culture, our New Zealand culture, particularly Māori culture, is an important part of tourism in this country, and it's a reason why a lot of people do come here, do come to our country. But I can't answer can't definitely answer that question for you, because I don't have enough information. But in terms of New Zealand borders, we are definitely working on that point.
Thank you, Thomas. I know New Zealand customs must respect the Treaty of Waitangi and must take into account the interests and needs of Maori people. And government authorities speak of Maori responsiveness. Maori responsiveness. How does this concept of Maori responsiveness, how does this materialize in practice?
We respect, within New Zealand customs, we have 3 specific principles that underpin what we do in New Zealand customs. It also relates back to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, the idea of manaakitanga, kotahitanga, and kaitiakitanga. So manaakitanga is to care for, kotahitanga is in unison with, or as one, and kaitiakitanga is guardianship of the borders. So those 3 things relate specifically to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the 3 articles of the Tiriti o Waitangi. It's about being able to protect, it's about being able to be a guardian of our borders, and making sure that we do a good job in being able to protect the borders on behalf of New Zealand and all its citizens, but also being able to respect Māori culture through these 3 principles of manaakitanga, kotahitanga, kaitiakitanga. And to a certain degree, customs is trying its very best to understand what these things mean for customs. We're very much in the early stages of being able to represent these principles in our work, but we are endeavouring to get a better understanding of it. It is a work in progress, but it's also connected to the strategic direction of where customs is going. So strategically, those sit really much at the forefront of our direction.
Thank you, Thomas. Now I have a series of small questions on border governance during COVID and trade and New Zealand customs challenges. Firstly, Thomas, how was the governance of New Zealand's borders at the time of COVID? What could you tell us about that?
I think our agencies did a really, really good job. Also the Prime Minister and her cabinet, and also the ministers of the Crown did a very, very good job in being able to close down the borders to stop anything coming over. However, and again, it relates back to the engagement with Māori and the connection with our Māori people. Where it sort of fell over or failed was the ability to be able to connect with the Māori people and deliver the messages to the Māori people about what was happening. So, we were just generally New Zealand citizens, part of New Zealand society. New Zealand society had a really good involvement in what was happening on the borders. The communication between the Crown and the government with our New Zealand as a whole was fine, was great. The communication directly with Māori people, which should have happened probably directly with our leaders, our rangatira in Māori communities. When you look at that and you break it down to the communication to the local Māori communities, didn't really happen. So, because a lot of our Māori society are really driven from local community, a lot of our people were not the responsiveness to Māori people on the ground, the local people, the local communities was not there. So this was something that came through COVID that challenged a lot of our government agencies to look at their engagement with Māori communities and Māori people, because the people who were actually suffering or who were missing a lot of the messages that should have been coming down were our Māori communities. So we were missing a lot of those messages. So what happened was there was mechanisms that were put into place of Māori leaders, iwi leaders, that was directly related to ministers and directly related to the Prime Minister, who work with Māori leaders in local Māori communities to improve the situation for Māori people during that time, because we were in lockdown, and we were in lockdown for quite a long time, and the resources that were being given out needed to be given by the local communities who were working for Māori people. So the Māori people themselves were getting what they deserved or getting what they needed. And this wasn't happening initially. But once the communication to direct communities changed, then it started to be better. But, in the early stages with the borders shutting, everything worked fine, mechanism-wise. But like I said, when I turn it back in and look at our Māori communities, we weren't served as efficiently or as effectively as probably should have been initially. Okay. We got there in the end, but it took a bit of a while to get there.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. My second question is, what other countries does New Zealand trade with? What are the main streams, Thomas?
Well, it's an interesting question, Ben. We find ourselves in an interesting position here in this country because, our largest trading partner, China, of course, we have a free trade agreement with China. So our trade agreement with China and our relationship with China is based really on the fact that we have a very good trading relationship. So that trading relationship sometimes is brought into the political arena because, what is New Zealand doing about some of the issues that are happening in China? And we sort of, we don't really like to sort of get involved in the internal issues to do with China because they are our largest trading partner. However, where do you sort of draw the line where you're a neutral? You're neutral in any sort of discussion that's happening globally. And yet a number of major powers in the world pointing fingers towards the Asian part of the world about things that are not happening and the human rights and stuff like that. Where do we sit as a nation that is a major trading partner with China? Another major trading partner is also our Australian relationship. So the Australians have always been almost like cousins to New Zealand. We've always had a close affinity to them, and we still remain today to have a close affinity to them. And also our tourism industry. Majority of our tourists that do come here from Australia also, seeking things like the snow. They love the snow, they love skiing, so they come here looking for the tourism experience. And also, just recently, we have had a development with the UK, signed a free trade agreement. These agreements, of course, are starting to develop tenfold for Māori businesses because with the way that the world is going with sustainability and with companies that represent more of a principled approach to world economy, world global environments and stuff like that, is where we sit, where our Māori businesses are very focused on global sustainability. So things are starting to change for Māori people and Indigenous because we're starting to get more noted. We're getting noticed more by large countries like the UK and Australia and America. In Canada, for instance, we now have an trade agreement with Canada as well. In part in Asians, where they're starting to take on board some of our very important Māori values of relationship building, of protecting the environment, which has been always been at the forefront of what makes us who we are as Māori, and the fact that we have a Māori identity. And when they talk to us, for instance, my iwi, they trade in seafood. So they have a few Asian partners, and we've had a lot of involvement with China. So our Asian partners are particularly interested in who we are and our identity, and they are very interested in us as Māori, not just us as a trading partner,
yes,
or just a business relationship. They want to know more about who we are, where we come from, our ancestral connections, which is not part of business conversations when you have them with other normal mainstream business. But these conversations are starting to happen more and more. Even with the UK, for instance, the UK, United Kingdom now have a relationship with the Māori people directly. They have an agreement that's been signed that they want to deal with Indigenous Māori businesses and what they have to offer. Same with the Canadian government. We have a relationship with the Canadian Minister of Indigenous Affairs over in Canada. She's been here just recently and has just recently signed an agreement with our New Zealand government around Indigenous connection to each other, Indigenous businesses connecting with each other. So it's quite an exciting area for our Māori people to be trading in now. Our Māori people have always been entrepreneurial, and it's really, really positive. Really positive. I might just come back from Canada, as you know, Ben, and it was really interesting to hear about the Canadian-American business partnerships that we're developing, particularly the businesses for Canadian Indigenous people. And that, they're starting to become more and more recognised in terms of how they develop an Indigenous framework of working in business, which is really, really positive, I think, for Indigenous people and Indigenous business worldwide. Very, very untapped, an untapped resource, I think, internationally, are the Indigenous people in business, and particularly what we value and what we represent as sustainable, principle-based businesses around the world. It's not all about profit. And the other thing, too, with Māori business, for instance, is about the collective people, the collective who benefit from it, not just the individual wealth developing for individual people, as we do in European culture. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. Third and last question of this small series. In terms of security or safety, what are the main challenges facing New Zealand's borders?
We have a number of issues that are facing our borders. Again, I think it's better to probably ask somebody from customs who's more au fait with the challenges we face on the borders. But I can tell you that we do have a number of challenges. One being our trade, for instance, making sure that our trade supply lines. This is following on from the COVID. That our supply lines and our trade has a continuous trade route, that we are continuously making sure that the trade routes are open, and that we are trading continuously with our partners without any issues. I think that's already sort of starting to sort itself out now that the borders are open and COVID is now being moved to the side. Another issue that we have, a major issue we have also, is drug trafficking that's happening across the border. Our intelligence, we're very lucky that in New Zealand Customs we have very good relationships with our partners, particularly our Five Eyes partners, our Canadian, American, Australian, and Europe, UK partners. So intelligence is being shared. We also have the emergence of AI and how that will look, artificial intelligence, and how that's going to look in the future for New Zealand. So what are we doing in terms of making sure that we are ahead of the game with technology that's starting to develop on our borders? And we are doing that now. So we are going through a process now strategically. We're positioning ourselves, but also we are starting to look at what models we can follow with our Canadian, American, and our Five Eyes partners, and also some of the examples that we have overseas. I would say that Māori Crown relationships is also one of the issues for customs. It doesn't figure up there as a major, but it is in terms of the Indigenous space and with our customs, the way that customs is actually operating and communicating with stakeholders. Māori ideas and developing relationships and engagement with Māori is going to become very important in the future for our New Zealand Customs Service.
One question about a military history question, if you want. I would now like to ask you a question about this history of military action from the Maoris. I know thousands of Maori are known to have been involved in the conflict of the Second World War, and they formed the 28th Battalion, or Maori Battalion, which distinguished itself in Italy, North Africa, and Greece. Thomas, how is this episode perceived in New Zealand by the Maori?
Our ancestors, and particularly our grandfathers, that did fight overseas in World War I and World War II, were known for their bravery, and particularly some Māori concepts that we talk about, for instance, mana, holding up the mana. So it was a political football, and that's probably another conversation that we can have. Initially, it was a political football to get them into World War I, to get them going over there to fight. As it turns out, out of necessity, they weren't going there to fight. They were going there to provide support to the soldiers that were fighting. But because so many New Zealand and Australian soldiers died in the conflict, there was a shortage of fighting men. So the Māori Battalion went from digging trenches to fighting on the front line. Mm-hmm. I have family that were part of that. My granduncle, for instance, was sent there. And they fought with distinction. However, the Māori Battalion, or the Pioneer Battalion, was made up of not only just Māori from New Zealand, but also our Pacific Island cousins, the Fijians, the Tongans, the Cook Islanders. They were part of that force that went over there. And like I said, initially they weren't going there to fight. They were going there to dig trenches, dig latrines and all sorts of things like that. But they ended up on the front line. And what transpired from World War I was they were noticed by the hierarchy or the main generals of the New Zealand and the British Army. They got noticed for their bravery, and also they got noticed because of the way they fight. That comes from a very, very long lineage or very long line of centuries. How I'll talk about how I mentioned the development of quite a intricate, well-developed Māori fighting style, hand-to-hand combat fighting style, which suited them when they went to World War I and World War II. So they got made. They were distinguished. They were held in quite high esteem by those generals who fought over there. So by the time World War I came about, the Māori battalion was developed specifically for Māori from New Zealand, iwi. They were iwi based. So we had 4 battalions that were developed, and they came from the 4 corners of New Zealand, and they were iwi representatives. So the best thing, what was decided was Māori fight better as Māori in the same. So tribally, they all based them tribally, so they fought better as tribesmen representing their tribes. This again was another successful formula because they fought with distinction in World War II. Even some famous German generals, well known to the world, Field General Rommel from Germany. I remember mentioned, "Give me the Māori battalion, and I will conquer the world." So he fought against them, and they were adversaries of the highest order as far as he was concerned. This was in Africa, when they fought in Africa. So as far as he was concerned, they were of the highest type of fighting adversary he had ever come across. So he made mention of them. So that's how they become famous. So even today, although we don't have a Māori battalion, and our last Māori battalion survivors passed now, so we don't have any more survivors of the Māori battalion. Even today in New Zealand, and through the decades, New Zealand soldiers, sailors, and Air Forcemen have held themselves in high esteem within the armed forces. And most recently, our Victoria Cross, the highest honour that's given, British award, military award was given to a Māori. So, we're very, very fortunate that our ancestors passed on to us the ability to be able to fight and fight with distinction.
Thank you, Thomas. It's the end of our interview. It's my last question, and my question is linked with your research about the links between Indigenous perspectives and customs and borders. And finally, Thomas, how can the Maori in particular and Indigenous peoples in general help us to better understand or rethink the phenomenon of borders, border governance, or border processes? Could you share with us your thinking about that?
One of the most important things is, and this is probably a message for global borders and globalization, is to carefully think about, when we think about borders, to carefully think about the contribution and the thinking and the depth of knowledge that's held by Indigenous people who have had borders for thousands and thousands of years, well before the European borders were created, and how to unlock that knowledge to better inform the world on, because my understanding from when I came back from Canada, my understanding of sitting in the BIG week with yourself and Professor Emmanuel, my understanding is that within those borders that we talked about, Indigenous people are a key part, will sit along those borders and have always sat there. They haven't sort of just disappeared overnight. They sit there, and their voice is very quiet. There's no recognition of Indigenous rights, which the UN has given Indigenous people. The UN has passed legislation within the UN that gives Indigenous people a voice in things like borders. So my encouragement really to our people that sit in borders and globalization is to rethink the Indigenous contribution to borders. What is the thinking and the knowledge that is held by Indigenous people that could support and assist and indeed help the phenomenon of borders? Because there are lots of conflicts that happen on borders, which I think Indigenous people voice, if it's added in, would be a valuable solution to some of the things that do exist around the world. And I think that Indigenous people bring with them a perspective and a worldview that is not often heard. And I think our perspective and our worldview of the world and how we see the world from our Indigenous eyes will be an important lens for considering some of the issues that do happen on borders. Even in the future in the area of AI, the Indigenous lens would have a really, really important role to play in the source of truth that underpin AI. And the voice that comes from Indigenous people will enable us to be able to think a bit more deeply and a bit more carefully about how that source of truth should relate to peoples around the world, because the principles and the values held by Indigenous people are pertinent to all people on the globe. So yeah, I think that's a really good question, Ben, and thank you very much for interviewing me. I'm sorry and I apologize that it's taken us so long. Such a big cope over. There's so much more I could say, but I'd like to really say thank you for your time and letting me come on here and talk to you.
No, thank you to you very much, Thomas, for participating in our podcast series. It was a very, very great discussion on a very rich subject and deep connections with Indigenous and perspectives of borders, but also of the world views. And thank you for sharing some Indigenous perspectives and concrete examples from the Maori people and the Maori culture. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Sure, Ben.
And this was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Thomas, and see you next month for the next issue. Bye-bye.